Hello, Spring is here, and I'm inside making a video for you. Hi guys, my name is Lula, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to reach 1500 elo in chess. So this video was requested after I made a video about reaching 1000 elo. So if you are struggling to reach 1000 elo, then go and watch that one. Why are you watching this one? You're in the wrong video. But yeah, if you are an intermediate level player and maybe you are struggling to reach 1500 or you're struggling to gain rating, maybe you're around that rating range, this video is for you. As somebody who had to reach 1500 as an adult, my personal opinion is that the difference between intermediate rated players and players who aren't quite there yet is strategy, positional understanding, and planning. Okay, so these are like three different things, but we're going to be talking more about the non-tactical side of chess today. I do believe that the majority of 1500 rated players and above can lose to somebody half of their rating by hanging a checkmate or hanging a tactic. However, I have pretty much never ever seen an intermediate level player be out-strategized by somebody significantly lower rated than them. And that's because it just doesn't happen. I think that in general, we train our tactics a lot because it's so easy to just log on and solve puzzles for 5 or 10 minutes. And we neglect our understanding of strategy and positional chess. So my goal in this video is not to teach you the following things in depth, but it is to introduce you to concepts that you may only be vaguely aware of. Maybe some of them you will or won't have heard of, but pretty much all of the things I'm going to talk about in this video, I'm sure there are 1 hour long Grandmaster masterclasses on each of them. So I cannot in depth teach you about every single concept in this video, but I would recommend making a list of the ones that you are less familiar with so that you can go and teach yourselves those. So number one is going to be the basics of positional chess. And so this is figuring out where your pieces should go. It is not enough to just know that you should develop towards the center. You should know that your rooks belong on open files. You should know that in endgames, you should try to get a rook to the 7th rank. You should know that your rooks should be doubled on the open file, and you should be familiar with Alekhine's gun. You should understand that knights belong on outposts, and you should understand the power of the bishop pair, specifically in open and more semi-open positions. This is what I mean by the positional rules of chess. You already know how much the pieces are worth and that they should probably be somewhere in the middle of the board, but there are specific positional ideas of what makes a piece good or bad, and that is largely to do with the placement of the pieces and the pawn structure. This gets me on to point number 2, which is talking about the superior minor piece. Now, if you have watched any of my videos, you'll probably know that I am a fan of Jeremy Silman, and his book, How to Reassess Your Chess, speaks in depth about superior and inferior minor pieces. It can be quite a complicated idea sometimes, and it can be difficult to know when a piece is going to be good or bad in a game because it's not just as simple as how it looks now, but it's also about transformations in the position. Will the piece be good in the endgame or not, and which pieces you should trade? However, I want to give you the most basic example possible. We know that in the French defense, black's dark squared bishop is not a very good piece, and as such, there are multiple sidelines designed specifically and only to trade off that piece. Hopefully, you will be able to look at a chessboard and be able to tell me which are the good pieces and which are the bad pieces, how you can improve those pieces, do those pieces have a future, and if not, how you can trade off those pieces. Silman explores this in depth. He posits that a knight can only be better than a bishop if it is installed on an extremely good outpost, and he makes some quite large statements like that. The reason it's important to understand superior and inferior minor pieces is because it will decide how you trade and how you move from opening to middle game and middle game to endgame. This is a complicated topic and will require a significant amount of further study, but it will help you enormously with strategy because, first of all, you will be able to have a checklist of what are my bad pieces? How can I improve them? How can I get rid of them? If not, what can my piece do if it is a bad piece? Number 3 is understanding all of the different types of center, by which I mean the pawn structure in the center of the chessboard. You may have heard of open centers, closed centers, dynamic centers, semi-open. Like, there are many types, and different coaches or grandmasters have written about different types. Not everybody agrees on how many there are. I don't want to get included in that discussion, but you can find a lot of videos, you can find books written about the different types of centers in pawn structures. What is important is that you should know that each center has to be played differently. You should know that in a closed center, you can play on the flank with a pawn storm in order to attack the enemy king because the center is locked and your opponent cannot hit back in the center. You should have probably heard a phrase saying that if somebody attacks you on the flank, hit back in the center. That is the most principled way to play chess. Well, the whole point of these closed centers is if somebody is attacking on the flank, you can't hit back in the center because it's closed off, and that's what allows you to play the center that way. You should also know that closed games just have different rules than open games. You can play backwards knight moves, you can slowly maneuver and reroute your pieces because it takes time for your opponent to launch their attack sometimes, and you have time to reconsolidate your army and move them to the other side of the board. It's just something that you could never do in an open center game. You should know that in open centers that you're probably not playing with your pawns, you're playing with your heavy pieces. You are trying to create threats and induce weaknesses in the enemy position using your strongest pieces. When the center is open and there are no pawns in the way, imagine how much more powerful your queen and your rooks become because they can see so many more squares than if they're hidden behind their own pawns. I will let you do your own research on open and closed centers and the other types of centers. There are lots of different types of pawn structure. The pawns are the infrastructure, the landscape upon which you're playing the chess game and can absolutely not be ignored. If you are the type of chess player who believes that pawns are getting in the way of checkmate, then I feel like this will hold you back strategically and your positional understanding may need to be worked on. Speaking of which, number 4 is understanding positional strengths and weaknesses, specifically pawns. Here I'm talking about understanding what an IQP is. This is a term that I am constantly asked to explain. The isolated queen pawn. You should understand about doubled pawns, tripled pawns, isolated pawns, different pawn islands, how many pawn islands there are. You should know about backwards pawns and what to do with them. So this is something that I think is a big positional weakness for a lot of intermediate level players. They are either not aware or they don't care enough about their pawn structure. I think that this is probably something a lot of people don't want to admit either, is that they are not comfortable with explaining these things. They don't know what the Carlsbad pawn structure is. Maybe one of their main openings has a Carlsbad pawn structure, but they have only vaguely heard about it in passing and they actually don't know what to do. So this is going to show in your games. For example, let's say you are playing a chess game and you don't know what to do. Look at the pawn structure. Does your opponent have an isolated queen's pawn? Do you know what to do if they have one? Do you know that you should control the square in front? Did you know that you should trade off the minor pieces? Did you know that you should put pressure on the pawn? Did you know that if your opponent has backwards pawns, you should also put pressure on that pawn and they must try to blockade it or put a piece in front of it to stop you from attacking it? Did you know that multiple pawn islands create weaker pawn structures and are worse for the endgame? Did you know that doubled pawns are much harder to use to create a passed pawn in the endgame? Like, there are a lot of things to know, and I am only giving you surface level information about them. But this is as important for you to win games as finding a tactic, because your opponent isn't always going to blunder. More importantly, when you understand positional weaknesses, you can make threats that induce your opponent to blunder. After you have been able to put the positional pressure on your opponent, then you can snap like a snake. That's my snake. That's my snake. I don't know why I was thinking of Karpov. I was thinking of like the snake. Has anyone seen Asterix and Obelix Mission Cleopatra? No. This is a snake. Okay, this somehow brings me to number 5, which is further endgame knowledge. It is not enough to know how to checkmate with a king and a queen and a king and a rook. You need to have strong understanding of king and pawn endgames regarding opposition, and you should be familiar with ideas of zugzwang, basically when your opponent only has bad moves left, and this kind of is important when you get to triangulation and things like mind squares. So these are endgame concepts that will become important because even though you might not get them right every time, they will decide games that you play. You may find it worthwhile to look at the 2 bishops checkmate because it's quite straightforward. There is a pattern to it. It's nothing like the bishop knight checkmate, which is a waste of your time, and there is not really any point looking at it. 2 bishops checkmate is really interesting for kind of understanding how these bishops control the squares and how good the bishop pair can be as well. And it's just another little checkmate to add to your repertoire, which is not too hard to learn. You can learn it on chess.com/endgames. Try your hand at some endgame studies. This is always fun and interesting and makes you wonder how chess works. Like, for example, this Reti endgame study, which makes it just looks like you cannot draw this position, but you can, which is crazy. The first time I saw it, my mind was blown. Baby Chess Lula was like, oh, hold up. So yeah, have a look at some endgame studies. You should have good, confident knowledge of the Philidor and the Lucina. You should be able to build your bridge. If you can't build your bridge, go back, build the bridge. You are definitely lacking some intermediate endgame knowledge. You can play these endgames against an engine because the technique is so clinical and specific for these that it shouldn't matter that you're playing against 3000 ELO engine if you know your Philidor and your Lucina. There are other important ideas in endgames like I said, rooks on the 7th, or cutting off the king, or the principle of 2 weaknesses. And I know none of us really like studying endgames because they're very unforgiving and harsh and they don't leave much room for creativity. But there is something really satisfying about winning a game because you had good endgame technique. It just makes you feel better than everybody else. Like I assume that's, how Magnus got the way that he is. So it is great to be able to convert a winning position. As I briefly mentioned before, it is worth taking a look at endgames associated with the openings that you play. So like if you play any of the openings that lead to a Carlsbad pawn structure, it's worth looking at this. Or if you play e4, e5, you should know basic ideas about the exchange Roy Lopez because you definitely don't want to trade off all your pieces in those positions because of the pawn structure in the endgame. There is quite a lot that is a consequence of the opening in the endgame. And so you should see if the openings that you play constantly lead to similar pawn structures and to see if there is anything. I mean, you will be, like I said, you will be able to find full books on each of these, but you don't need to master them. You need to have just more understanding than your opponent. So any study is a good amount of study. Trying to become familiar with as much of what I've mentioned as possible will help you to win games and help you to gain rating. I'm not expecting you to master these things. You would be a chess master. As always, my advice is not to tell you this so that you can go and play a 3-minute game and then with 20 seconds left on the clock think, oh, did Lula say something about backwards pawns? Like that is the entire opposite of what I would like. After you watch this video, I think that if you want to improve your strategy and positional understanding, you need to have time to think about that in the chess game. And so playing longer games is always my advice, as long as possible. Please, with increment as well, so that you can start to try to put these concepts into practice and improve your chess in a serious way. Just to reinforce what I said at the beginning, I would highly recommend How to Reassess Your Chess by Jeremy Silman. It is an intermediate positional chess manual. It is very, very helpful and quite complete. You, like I said, can find hours and hours of videos about every single concept I've mentioned here. So I'm sorry I couldn't go into more depth, but I hope you're able to make some notes of things that I have mentioned that you can now go away and study on your own. And it will give you at least a checklist of things where you can feel like you have actually learned something concrete and you can add that to your repertoire of chess skills. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys.